Hello, Mr. Bokovic, just checking you are here with us and you can hear us. Good morning. I think he cannot hear us. I can stay Sabah al-Khair. Posso começar? Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. At the beginning of our meeting, I would like to introduce you to the purpose of this South-South cooperation session. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. The purpose and objectives of the session are to convene partner countries, development partners, non-state organizations, and social partners to foster an open and forward-looking discussion on the effectiveness principles, including country ownership, focus on results, transparency, mutual accountability, and inclusive partnerships that help South-South practices around the world based on insights developed by partners involved in the GPEDC over the last years. Speakers will propose concrete actions to further use the self-assessment framework, which is the purpose of the discussion today, and the roadmap at the country level. It is a pleasure for me to moderate this panel with the colleagues here present, which I will introduce one by one as I give you the floor. The ILO, in particular my organization, also attaches great importance to South-South and triangular cooperation, and we have been actively working with GPEDC either as observers or as part of the marketplace for GPI, Global Partnership Initiative, and other endeavors, so we are happy to be here. This also will be a complementary discussion to the panel of session 8, creating opportunities to deliver South-South cooperation, where my director, who is sitting here as well, will be moderating, and there will be a dialogue between the two sessions. So this spotlight is also reviewing the country studies for adopting voluntary guidance in triangular cooperation. And this is very important because we are testing some mechanisms to see how countries can adapt South-South cooperation to their country context. This is also done in the UN system through works that we have on improving, integrating South-South cooperation into the common country assessment and the cooperation frameworks. But before I start the panel, I will hand over to Dr. André de Mello for setting the scene. André de Mello in Souza is a senior researcher and compatriot from Brazil of the Institute for Applied Economic Research, a Brazilian governmental think tank. He earned a PhD in political science from Stanford and has previously worked as professor of international relations at the PUC, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And he has a specialty in several topics, including a focus on South-South and BRICS. So, André de Mello, you have the floor.
Thanks, Anita, and many thanks to the organizers of the summit, and particularly Mr. Luis Roa and Rafael Figueira for the invitation to speak at this session. I will try to set the scene by first recalling the origins of the Development Cooperation Effectiveness Agenda. Concerns with effectiveness emerged in the context of, on the one hand, scarcity of resources in the ambit of the fiscal crisis that took place in the late 90s. And on the other hand, of severe criticism of aid as being unfit for the purpose of promoting development, and in worst case scenarios, even being counterproductive for that purpose. Accordingly, the aid effectiveness agenda was in part a response to taxpayers and stakeholders in general who were pressuring governments not just for better use of resources, but also to ensure that that spending was more legitimate. Hence, as you know, the Paris Declaration of 2005 represented a first attempt to incorporate effectiveness principles within international development cooperation. At about the same time, South-South cooperation significantly expanded, not just in volumes, but also in the diversity of modalities that were being implemented and in geographical scope, geographical reach. Yet many of the Southern providers, they saw the aid effectiveness agenda as essentially driven by Northern donors and as antithetical to South-South cooperation. And resistance to the agenda had both ideological as well as practical concerns, motivations. Ideologically, many of these countries see South-South cooperation as essentially distinct from development cooperation provided by Northern donors, and as embracing a totally different narratives that has also different historical roots, motivated by solidarity and friendship, and therefore not bound by rigid norms regarding measurement, information and results management and reporting, rankings, comparisons, reviews, and the like. In practice, and perhaps most importantly, Southern countries often lack the financial, the institutional, and the human resources necessary to carry out evaluations and assessments of their cooperation. But these arguments shouldn't be overstated. Since Paris, as you know, there has been a growing participation of major Southern providers in the subsequent high-level forums of Accra in 2008, and mainly in Busan in 2011, which has led to a shift of focus from aid effectiveness to development cooperation effectiveness. The agenda was broadened and became less technocratic, but at the same time, it also lost precise targets and indicators. And partly as a result of Southern inputs to this agenda, the so-called Busan principles resemble and are closely associated to the principles of South-South cooperation. Moreover, the South is not a monolithic bloc. While some of the largest Southern providers, such as Brazil, India, and China, have not acted as members nor engaged in the global partnerships, others, such as Mexico, Colombia, and Indonesia, have shown more willingness to take part and to engage in this partnership. It is significant that the first page of the Busan Declaration presents a statement demanded by India and China, and I quote, "The principles, commitments, and actions agreed in the outcome document in Busan shall be the reference for South-South partners on a voluntary basis," end of quote. This leads me to the initiatives of applying the self-assessment framework for effective South-South cooperation, as well as the voluntary guidelines for effective triangular cooperation. And they have several merits, in my view. First, they're sensitive to concerns of the South, and they're adequately designed to placate political opposition. So the keywords here are self-assessment and voluntary. In the studies that have been performed and that are forthcoming, Southern providers assess themselves, keeping control of the entire assessment process and owning the results. And there's also an explicit caveat that these studies and the application of the framework itself is not meant to rank countries in any ways. Likewise, the guidelines for triangular cooperation are adopted and followed on a voluntary basis, and the positive results shown in case studies may encourage other development cooperation providers to embrace them as well. Secondly, it is also noteworthy that in these case studies, Southern countries perform different roles in triangular cooperation, including as pivotal partners, as facilitating partners, and as beneficiary partners. This provides opportunities for these countries to face development challenges from different perspectives and not from a fixed position, so to speak. And thirdly and finally, the case study method is certainly adequate for the purpose of investigating the implementation of the framework and the guidelines, given the importance of cultural, social, and economic and political contexts in implementing the Busan principles. As you know, contextual variables are difficult to measure and to quantify, and they require profound knowledge of and immersion into the partner country as a selected case. On the downside, the self-assessment framework and the voluntary guidelines, they reflect a weakening of the stronger commitments that originally guided the aid effectiveness agenda in Paris. Specific targets and indicators were replaced with looser and vaguer voluntary adherence to Busan principles, and the responsibilities for achieving results were similarly diluted. Moreover, the self-assessment framework, like others that came about before, is only capable of assessing process, that is to say, the degree to which the Busan principles were followed, but not their impact on development. It remains to be seen if the difficulties in assessing impact can be overcome over time with access to more and better data and more sophisticated frameworks and methodologies, or whether this is an inherent difficulty that we'll have to deal with. And obviously, there's always a merit in assessing process as well. So I'll stop here. Many thanks.
Thanks, Andrea. And I heard some interesting points, including the importance of impact, results, better data, and also the question of the voluntary nature of these guidelines. So I think these are very important points to set the scene. And maybe then I'll go first to Colombia, who has really an experience with doing these voluntary studies. And I'd like to introduce Mr. Álvaro Calderón Ponce de León, who is a director of the International Cooperation Agency from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was before in the permanent mission of Colombia to OAS as an alternate representative, and has been engaged in development cooperation for many decades. So overall, according to the voluntary study undertaken by Colombia, there has been really strengthened capacities of institutions and measurements of communities, including gender equality through transformative approaches. So that is very important. I have the following question for you based on this knowledge. Colombia has led the work of the Global Partnership to assess the effectiveness of South-South cooperation provided by several countries. What were the main findings of this work, and what is the most common challenges countries face in improving the effectiveness of this cooperation, bearing in mind the context that Andrea de Mello has already set up on this intricate South-South horizontality, but also interesting aspects of the triangular cooperation? Over.
Anita, thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm going to switch to Spanish. Un saludo para los panelistas.
Greetings to all of our panelists here, and for those who are present face-to-face and those who are accompanying us virtually. Anita, you have touched upon a fundamental element in this whole process, and the participation of Colombia, I think, is an interesting experience to share with you. So the question, as you put it, was what were the main findings during the work that was done with Colombia's participation? Now, let me just kick off like this. What was sought? What were we looking for? And the idea is to try to come as close as possible to the following. How do effectiveness principles help with the practices, solutions, cooperation, and triangular cooperation? In the particular case of Colombia, the exercise, which was done in the same way with 6 additional countries, as Dr. Melo mentioned it, countries of Latin America, Asia, and Africa, in order to validate the potentialities and the limitations in measuring the effectiveness of South-South cooperation. Through the multidimensional index of South-South cooperation effectiveness, which, as we all know, rests on 4 principles: national, focus on results, transparency, and mutual responsibility, including partnerships. Before moving to the findings directly, in the case of the index in Colombia, I just wanted to say that the pilot project or exercise set out to have a list of markers that were wide enough and flexible enough to measure the actions of South-South cooperation, which are being generated in this global system. But allow me, Anita, to start from one particular postulate. What cannot be measured cannot be improved. And I think that that is something that will help us as we move forward. Measuring cooperation, these are instruments to improve the mechanisms. The and the practices that are being used. And so from an exogenous point of view of measuring, this exercise of assessing or measuring, we were able to conclude that the instrument is, in fact, applicable. It can be applied, and that's our starting point. The 44 questions which are used for the measurement of the fulfilling of the 4 effectiveness principles could be verified in a broad way in cooperation practices, South-South, implemented by Colombia. The results were broken down for each one of the principles, give us an index, one, first of all, of the opportunities to improve and the failings. And in the endogenous reading of the methodology of the instrument, in the case of Colombia, we were able to see, for example, that the questions applied were actually quite general and did not actually reveal much about the integrity of the ecosystem that helps in this case. And so the indicator, which is associated with the national appropriation, was blind. We were able to repeat this in the case of the principle, which was the focus of governance and management of information monitoring, evaluation, and reporting results. And the questionnaire was multiple choice with closed questions, and this made it possible for us to reveal the what makes it possible to collect the information and the building of the reports, which were made to show aspects such as transparency in the cooperation flows. And in this sense, the result of this indicator was based on proving that to date, we did not actually have, in fact, a governance document with data for the management of the supply and the demand. And so, finally, it was a valid exercise that made it possible to measure the effectiveness of the South-South cooperation mechanism from the effectiveness principles, based on the effectiveness principle in the general framework of global cooperation. However, we have to rethink the questionnaire. The questionnaire has to be reprogrammed, if you will, because of the actual things that are happening in the countries and in the region when we're talking about the exercise of South-South cooperation, to be able to report on it. If I may, Anita, I'd like to refer to a couple of the findings which we find in terms of the effectiveness of cooperation. And I'd like to say that this exercise was able to show, in terms of measuring regions, that Latin America was a bit above, slightly above Asia and Africa in the case of for some indicators, the cooperation is in line with the national priorities that are a part of the examination of programs and strategies. Also, the countries have instruments to measure the data related to cooperation, which clearly have to be improved, but they're there at least. And then finally, the generation of partnerships. If there's a challenge in the way in which all of this works out, we have to think about the private sector and the importance of the private sector. I'll stop here. Thank you very much, Mr. Alvaro. Well, a couple of points. I'll switch to Spanish now. The importance of national empowerment, transfer, formal, mutual cooperation is important. Back to English.
Important points of these voluntary guidelines are country ownership and demand-driven cooperation, the shared commitment, focus on results, inclusive partnerships, transparency, innovation and co-creation, joint learning, and leaving no one behind. So I think this was very interesting to hear your experience. Some very concrete also recommendations for improvement of the questionnaires, and also some of the concrete indicators that are useful for a more efficient and results-based South-South cooperation. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Ms. Miriam Sena Vieira, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation of Cabo Verde. Bom dia. Ms. Vieira was a graduate in international relations and career diplomat. She has held posts of advisor of Cabo Verde's permanent mission to the UN, Deputy Coordinator of Experts of the Africans Group Third Committee, and Desk Officer for Cabo Verde in the UN system, among many other things. So, Cabo Verde has a long history of cooperating with Lusophone countries in Africa through South-South and Triangular Cooperation. So maybe a question for you was based on your experience and also in the context of the community of Portuguese-speaking countries, the CPLP. Maybe there are some experiences that you can envisage in terms of how to do South-South and triangular cooperation, bearing in mind these principles. And we know that your country is very engaged in South-South, including also in the fields of decent work and others. So what would you appreciate learning about some concrete examples, especially linking these reports on South-South cooperation, and have you have overcome some of these challenges? Over to you, Ms. Vieira.
Thank you so much. Bom dia. So for us, it's a pleasure
Good day.
discussing important topics when it comes to South-South cooperation. Is something that Cabo Verde do attach great importance to improve the deliverables on South-South cooperation. And then also I would like to thank here the representative from Colombia for the insights he shared here with us when they conduct the first exercise on self-assessment framework, where also Cabo Verde took part in this exercise, and then for us was big a challenge to provide some information. But I have to say that also this exercise opened the doors for improvement to overcome remaining challenge. And as you know, all of us know here in this room, South-South cooperation has its own dynamics and characteristics that differs from North and South cooperation. And then it's based on the principle of solidarity. And that's why we used to say that South-South cooperation is not the substitute of North-South cooperation, but rather it's a complement to North and South cooperation. Cabo Verde, as Anita rightly pointed out, is one of has a long history or experience in this kind of cooperation with not only with African country, but also now we have been seeing this cooperation going forward with many countries in our sub-region, and then with Morocco, Egypt, other African countries, and many others outside the African continent, such as Brazil, India, so far. I have to highlight that this cooperation has proven that is essential for realization of sustainable development goals, although South-South cooperation marked by the lack of resource, financial resource, and other constraints that arise from the problems of the global South. From our experience, I can tell that its utmost strength is its ability for improving capacity building, which is essential to implement cooperation actions within the North-South cooperation and South-South cooperation itself. This is the great value of South cooperation. And needless to say that the technical assistance is basically the common or global modality of South-South cooperation, through which countries can also exchange best practices and share knowledge, which is a must for aid effectiveness as well. Cabo Verde has been doing this cooperation with other Portuguese-speaking countries, such as Brazil, as I said, having a huge positive impacts in reducing poverty. We have been seeing this, and strengthening education. Many civil servants and experts in Cabo Verde, they were beneficiary of higher education in Brazil. And then now they are working for development of the country. This is something that we do value. And we have been doing a lot of cooperation in health sector that also help the country to build and boost the health system. For instance, I have to tell you that within the framework of cooperation with Brazil, Cabo Verde was the first African country to have a human milk bank established in Africa, which also helped us to reduce the child mortality and also have qualified, trained health professional in this area. Improvements have been realized in other sectors such as housing policies, digital transformation, and many other fields for sustainable development. It is important to note that from this cooperation, Cabo Verde is now, if I can say, a provider or a partner of South-South cooperation. And when it comes to share the best practice in e-governments, we now have been realizing that many other countries in our sub-region, they are pretty much interested in know our experience and to be more aware about our experience in implementing such projects that foster the good governance in the country, also in the field of innovation, digitalization, renewable energy, because Cabo Verde is a champion in renewable energy, migration governance, and in other sectors for sustainable development. Another important aspect that I would like to raise here is that how also triangular cooperation, we had opportunity to take advantage from South-South cooperation with other countries. Here I would like to raise an important project that we have, for instance, with Luxembourg and São Tomé e Príncipe, that the main objectives is to scale up the skills of students from São Tomé e Príncipe in professional training that obviously would help them to booster some policies in tourism sector, for instance. And I can also mention the advantage taken from the United Nations agencies, funds, and programs. We had also an experience with ILO in boosting the knowledge sharing in social protection and child labor, the combat on child labor, which reveals to be very important for CPLP countries. But from what I heard from Colombia, I think there are three things that we should take into consideration. First of all is to adapt development cooperation effectiveness principles into the South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation, mainly taking into account some principles such as building a more result-based management tools, but also to foster the mutual accountability mechanism. What Cabo Verde has been doing with some partners of the South is to strengthen the regular dialogue with countries, but we think that we can go even behind that to strengthen these dialogues and other mechanisms for mutual accountability, and also, which is important, to monitor the results. And then to monitor the results, we need also to enhance the capacity to collect data within the South-South cooperation, which is a big challenging because many modalities is not, I wouldn't say it's not possible, but I think that we should have tools, effective tools, in order to measure those kind of modalities of South cooperation. And then a second thing that I would like to say here is to explore more on the potential of South-South cooperation. I have seen a report, I think it was OECD report, that was calling to unlock the potential of South cooperation as the global landscape has been changing in this global South. Now we have a lot of emerging countries that can also boost a little bit this cooperation within the global South. But at the same time, we have other dynamics that can tell us that we can also seize the opportunity of the role that other actors, such as private sector, I heard here you mentioned academia, they can also have an important role to play in South-South and triangular cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vieira. It's a real pleasure to speak also to a Lusophone colleague. And as we would say, minha pátria, minha língua. My country is my language. So that's also part of the South-South interactions, sharing with Lusophone countries. And you said some very important points in terms of South-South and triangular cooperation with CPLP, including recalling the social protection, child labor, and there's also so much work on social and solidarity economy and other areas. And some lessons learned also of the effective cooperation that we learned from Colombia and how that can be applicable and adaptable to other countries and other contexts. So thanks so much. And now the next speaker will be focusing really on triangular cooperation. So it's Mr. Andrew Smith, Director General of International Assistance Policy Bureau at Global Affairs Canada. Previously, Andrew co-led the design and launch of Canada's $1.6 billion international assistance innovation program. That's a lot, huh? So I can imagine some of that will go to South-South and Triangular right now. Prior to that, he was Director for Corporate Planning and Policy in Global Affairs Canada, Asia branch, and has also been responsible for Pan-Asian Regional Development Assistance Program known as TRIGGER, Trade and Investment and Growth. You have a PhD in political science from the Australian National University. So, Mr. Smith, Canada has been really leading this work of triangular cooperation and the GPEDC as a core member of the Global Partnership Initiative for Triangular Cooperation, which is so important because this dynamics of South-South cooperation is also benefiting from the North, right? So the South-South-North interaction, but still leaving the ownership with the countries, facilitator, pivotal countries of the South, so important as well. So in this regard, based on Canada's experience, what are some examples of activities or practices that support this triangular cooperation? And like, for example, we know that you undertake some trust-building activities, matchmaking, and we heard so much that word trust yesterday on the fragility session. So maybe you can mention a little bit some of those important triangular cooperation activities. Over.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a real honor to be here with colleagues from Capo Verde, from Colombia, civil society, academia, and representing northern partners in the triangular cooperation efforts. I think Professor de Mello pointed out, I think these three elements of partnership, which I think are worth repeating, being a beneficiary partner, a pivotal partner, and a facilitating partner. And the nature of triangular cooperation that allows for this kind of fluidity of relationships, and that a northern donor could be any one of those partners, a southern donor could be any one of those partners. You could have academia, you could have private sector, that this is really an evolution of kind of multi-stakeholder partnerships. And we talk about triangular or trilateral cooperation, I think is really just it's a kind of placeholder for the multi-stakeholder nature of the kinds of partnerships that are evolving in this kind of rubric of thinking. As you noted, Canada has been quite engaged on triangular cooperation through the GPEDC, through the Global Partnership Initiative. And one thing that we took on in 2021 was a series of case studies that was designed to really, I think, look at the voluntary guidelines for effective triangular cooperation and see how they work in practice. I would say that as far as the triangular cooperation GPI, it's quite well developed with the voluntary guidelines in place. It's really now a question of seeing how they can be implemented, how they can be applied, and how they can be adjusted over time to support more effective cooperation in this area. So this series of case studies looked at Colombia, looked at Indonesia, looked at South Africa, and if anyone's interested, these case studies are available in the GPEDC library, resource library. And what we found was that in each of these cases, the triangular cooperation initiatives fostered trust, knowledge exchange between partners, and increased impact. So for us, that was encouraging, seeing that those voluntary guidelines, when applied, could result in important types of partnerships and important development impacts. And there were 4 key practices that emerged from this. One was that effective triangular cooperation requires a dedicated and active facilitator. Generally, these kinds of partnerships they're not, they can be quite labor intensive, and you need to have a committed facilitator often who brings the different partners together. Secondly, we found that horizontal coordination was very important, that you had multi-stakeholder planning and strong alignment with national and local plans. Thirdly, inclusive partnerships were essential, widespread participation in all aspects of the initiative from each of the partners involved, and that there should be and fourthly, a focus on vulnerability, and that there should be a systemic plan to tackle vulnerability and inequality. Now, there were elements that we found were lacking somewhat, and in particular, we found gaps in applying gender-sensitive approaches. And if anyone was up at 8:30 yesterday listening to the gender equality discussion, you would know that Canada has a feminist international assistance policy, so we're quite sensitive to issues around gender equality. But what I would note is that the DAC has recently put out gender guidance that we think could be quite useful in complementing the voluntary guidelines. In terms of next steps, we feel that within the GPI, we could probably take further steps to look at toolkits and roadmaps that can build on the case studies and the learning from the kinds of activities that have been taking place and looking at how we can further develop more practical and operational tools to implement the voluntary guidelines. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks so much. These are really, really important principles. So we'll really look into how this effective cooperation, horizontality, the question of inclusiveness that you brought up, and the question of systemic plan of vulnerabilities and gender sensitivities. I think this is what I would retain from what you have been saying. Very important. And really this reflection for us on how to really have this sensitivity, and I think gender is really a part that we have a long road to go, I think, on the South-South and Triangular, because often there's been other priorities, and this has been a little bit left behind, and it should be really at the forefront. Now I'd like to move to the virtual colleague. The ISDB is reaching us online. Mr. Amer Bukvic, who is the Director General of Global Practices and Partnerships from the Islamic Development Bank. I hope you've been following through remote nicely our discussions. Amer leads the product and strategic direction in the areas of public and private financing and knowledge products. He builds upon the existing relationships with major development partners. He has also been for more than 15 years the CEO of the Bosna Bank International, and he's co-founded the Sarajevo Business Forum and Sarajevo Halal Fair. So we are particularly happy to have you here. We in particular in the ILO have just signed an agreement with the ISDB, so we're very happy as well about that. And the Islamic Bank has also been very active in the Global Partnership Initiative for Effective Triangular Cooperation. And you are one of the co-creators, as we would say. This is a very important word in the GPI and the GPADC new language is co-creation. So could you briefly explain to us how your reverse linkage policy works and how it aligns with the effectiveness principles, and how also it links up, of course, to South-South and Triangular Cooperation in national frameworks? So over to you, Mr. Bukvic, and hoping that you've been able to follow us from remote.
Yes, thank you very much. Very good morning to all of you. I am sorry not to be able to physically attend the event, very inspirational event of sharing these unique ideas that we are hearing this morning. Before explaining how our reverse linkage policy works and its alignment with the development effectiveness principles, I would like to briefly introduce to you the ISDB reverse linkage modality. ISDB reverse linkage modality is a homegrown South-South cooperation modality introduced by the bank to facilitate the exchange of knowledge, expertise, and solutions among its 57 member countries to tackle their development challenges. And as you know, ISDB is primarily a South-South institution. We have South-South cooperation is in our DNA because all our member countries are from the South. And we believe in the bank that all our member countries have something to share, regardless of their developmental level, and they are also very much willing to benefit from one another. And just to know, actually our member countries, more than half of them classified as the least developed member countries. But regardless, we believe that all of them have something to share. So the bank decided to scale up the South-South cooperation and its reverse linkage. And in 2017, the policy was approved. The reverse linkage policy was meant to set the practical operational boundaries and define the features of reverse linkage, standardizing its use across ISDB member countries. It adopts the internationally recognized South-South cooperation principles, including the respect for national sovereignty, the national ownership and independence, the equality, the non-conditionality, the non-interference in domestic affairs, and mutual benefit. Since 2017, the policy has been guiding all ISDB reverse linkage projects. And just to give you a few statistics, to date, we have approved more than 45 reverse linkage projects across a wide spectrum of sectors and thematic areas. These projects connected more than 33 member countries, allowing them to work together to tackle the pressing development challenges and achieve the Agenda for 2030 Sustainable Development. In terms of the reverse linkage alignment with the development effectiveness principle, this has been manifested in the reverse linkage features that are at the heart of the policy, namely the strategic alignment, inclusivity, win-win arrangements, ownership and commitment, and peer-to-peer approach. Under the strategic alignment feature, we attach high importance to demand-driven, and that all reverse linkage interventions must be in line with the recipient's country's national development. The win-win arrangement features highlight that everyone involved in any reverse linkage intervention has something to share and something to gain, be it provider, recipient, or even the development partner involved. The ownership and commitment features is to make sure that any partner involved in reverse linkage puts something on the table, be it financial or in-kind contribution. This is key to ensuring commitment and accountability of all stakeholders involved. Under the peer-to-peer approach, we facilitate the development of result-oriented development solutions by both provider and recipient country. At the bank, we strongly believe in the power of reverse linkage as an effective South-South cooperation tool that can be used to contribute to the 2030 agenda of SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I use this opportunity of being with you this morning, although me being removed, but I still use this opportunity to welcome you all to explore the areas where we can cooperate together under the reverse linkage modality of IDB and generally the South-South cooperation. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Amer Bukvic. Very interesting, the reverse linkage experience, and I think this is a very learning experience for us. And all of us now here, now I see there's a bigger number of people. At 8 a.m. it was a bit hard to arrive everybody, but now the room is filling up, and we're all learning a lot about the reverse linkage and how it links up to the BAPA plus 40 principles and the effectiveness principles of GPI. So it's very interesting on the peer learning, mutual accountability, and partnership building. So thank you so much for that. Now it's time for civil society. So I'm going to introduce the Tsuk Kim Pop, right? Guatemala. It's not a pop band we just heard this morning. Mr. Henry Morales is the executive director of the Tsum Kim Pop movement in Guatemala. It's linked to actually some Mayan traditions and indigenous populations. So the name sounds very exciting, but it's also because of the important cultural heritage background that we have. Harry Morales holds a PhD in economics and business from UNED Spain and a PhD with a specialization in development economics from the Basque Country. So it seems like you have two PhDs. He is currently executive coordinator of the Tsuk Kim Pop movement, which I looked up actually, and I saw you have a very lively Facebook page, so I would advise you all to go to the Tsum Kim Pop movement page. He's a researcher, social activist, and has published several studies on cooperation and development. Mr. Morales' South-South and Triangular Cooperation projects aspire to be inclusive and engage different actors from civil society. For us, it's very important in the ILO to have also social partners, so not only governmental institutions. So what's very important, the governmental as well. But however, this is not often the case, the engagement of the civil society. And we heard that very much in the past 3 days, the importance of civil society engagement. From the perspective of the civil society as well as social partners, what are the main challenges that you need for wider South-South and triangular cooperation? And what tools would you need to make it more systematically understood and shared? Over to you, Morales.
I'll be speaking in Spanish. I'm sorry. It's a pleasure to be here in this room on this panel. Speaking helps. It's much better to look at recommendations and hear them and suggestions, because in the end, that's what it comes down to. Talking about South-South cooperation is in a historic practice in our countries. It has always existed, but it's been changing, and we've been trying to make it more reality-based, more permanent. I think that something that was raised is very important. The South-South cooperation idea is a kind of a philosophy. It's not a formula. It's a philosophy that means solidarity and being able to share. So international cooperation should hold this view as well. And in this concept of solidarity, of sharing what we have, it seems to us that there are many changes and that we'll have to meet if we want to move forward with the South-South cooperation and turn it into a tool for international governance and development. International development and cooperation is part of this. Many things are at stake, many different interests. Humanitarian, democratic interests are at stake, and they're all linked to an economic reality. There are many linked interests at stake, and And I think we should look at the intentions of modernizing South-South cooperation, have an alternating mode to exchange between different countries and peoples, share our problems, live together, but being aware of the realities of the different countries and nations. So here we're taking a global look, but I'd like to wind up with a particular experience of Latin America and the Caribbean, where I come from. South-South cooperation is present there in all areas of life globally, but unfortunately, it's not given a lot of value, unfortunately, in a systematic way so far. And it seems to us that we must bolster the institutional aspects. We must turn to planification and link this to greater efficiency and use the global momentum. But we haven't so far been able to strengthen our capacities, regional, national capacities, or global ones in South-South cooperation. Have gotten help in organizing our cooperation, and South-South cooperation should have an independent institution that would support these processes so that we will manage to turn this into reality. I think this should take place globally and on the national and regional level as well. Another important element if South-South cooperation only is identified as taking action, well, we're carrying out 20 actions, and they can be of different ilks, but we aren't giving a monetary value to them because they're invisible. And here we've been talking about quantities in these fora, but we haven't been talking about actions as such. And it would be better to look at the policies that govern all of these agendas. If South-South cooperation continues talking about projects, but we don't put numbers on them, then when we won't be able to compete with developed countries and we won't be able to participate in the decisions that are taken in these areas. Monetarization of cooperation is something that has to be carried out, even if it's only as a reference to measure trends. We have to look at the technical cooperation where there are standards. And in the end, it's a question of systematized methods for this. Another important idea, and we give great value to this, socially speaking, concerning partnerships for development, is that within civil society or academia or with other active players in development, we have a lot of experience, and this is being lost on a national level. We're looking at public matters, and this is not being taken on board, but it could be very useful. It could help us to look at all of this and go beyond what we've been doing and go into other types of cooperation, not only bilateral cooperation, and we should work in this regard. And if we don't offer objective goals that will help us to measure trends, then we're not giving formal support for these proposals. So we've been monitoring South-South cooperation to show that South-South cooperation is present and is very important globally. we carried out in a study that is paradigmatic in the sense that it's global in Cuban cooperation. We have this study, and it's available to you. What we wanted to show was how Cuba, despite the many problems it endures, which is a developing country, has managed to generate global cooperation that fills all the requisites of cooperation of great quality. In order to be able to adopt this dimension, they've monitorized Cuban cooperation in the United Nations, with the EU, through technical cooperation. And there have been surprises, because when we get all the data in, when we look at the monetary data, we see that it's 50% that needs to be reached. And the results of this study were impressive. In Latin America and the Caribbean ranks almost as #1 when we talk about collaboration. For Cuba, it's health and social matters. We have a lot of data now. For Africa, it would be one of the major collaborators, and Asia. So if we manage to carry out this particular exercise, we see what countries are doing. Traditionally, countries have been receivers, and now we can say that they're donors, and we would be able to produce more, better. It would be more democratic, and I'm talking about international cooperation. And it would manage to reach structural problems, because in the end, that's what we really want to change. So cooperation, in the end, can respond to other interests. And one day, let's hope, more people will be able to live in peace and with well-being. So that's what we want. We want to be able to bring them more, but we'll have to strengthen our systems for us to be able to leap ahead and become more dynamic and active players. Thank you.
Presentación.
Very interesting presentation. Thank you. It's interesting to talk about South-South cooperation as a philosophy. It's the first time I've heard that. It's be interesting to mull this over. And South-South solidarity is very natural, but at the same time, we take note of what you've said about monetarization, having better results of South-South cooperation, of finding ways to organize, like the triangular cooperation that OECD organizes, in order to come up with a discussion. I think that this forum has been a privileged place for us to do that.
To all speakers, I'll have one question. I think in the program here it says 5 minutes each, but in the interest of time, maybe 2 minutes reply each would be great. And then we will open for the questions and answers, if any. And we have some sophisticated systems here of that Luis will pass me through WhatsApp the questions you have through the platform. But first of all, I wanted to ask, what would be one good practice that you see that could really increase and improve the effectiveness of South-South cooperation, and also the principles therein, these effectiveness principles? Maybe starting this way, maybe starting with you, Andrew Smith, and then going on. So I would say 2 minutes each, so that we can keep up with the time.
Sure. I would just note, at risk of repeating myself, I would say that the voluntary guidelines are on triangular cooperation, having been built on the Busan principles, really are an important element of enabling triangular cooperation and the kinds of partnerships that are evolving through both South-South cooperation and triangular and multi-stakeholder partnerships. And I think there are three key elements to that. One is that it's very important that these relationships are transparent. There are inclusive partnerships and very open communications. Secondly, their beneficiary ownership and accountability is clear and well established. And finally, that solutions and approaches are jointly defined, that there's a very horizontal, non-hierarchical relationship between partners. I think moving forward, the GPDC is in a very good position to continue to support the implementation of the voluntary principles. And now really is the time to take them forward. There should be ongoing work to refine and improve policies and toolkits and guidelines, as I was noting, but I really do feel like we have a very solid foundation for a kind of global understanding of how to move forward with these types of arrangements. Thanks.
Thanks. So maybe you can just pass the floor to Miriam Vieira, the Deputy Minister of Cabo Verde. So also reflecting on these good practices and principles of South-South cooperation.
Thank you so much. I think during my first intervention, I mentioned in some extent, what kind of principle we need to boost in South-South cooperation. I mentioned the question of to build a more reliable mutual accountability mechanism. Although we do know that the basic principle of South-South cooperation is solidarity, as the representative of civil society rightly expressed all the dimension and then the philosophy behind it. And it's something that we do share and then agree with the way he rightly explained the dimension of South-South cooperation. But I think that the biggest strength of it is that it offers the possibility to even go behind the initial scope of cooperation. I'm going to give you an example. We had a project that were basically to reinforce the capacity of teacher to deal with students that need special needs. And that was the first objective of the project. But now, because of that, we realize that the country needs also to put in place its national strategy in order to boost special education needs. So what I'm trying to say here is the South-South cooperation is very rich. Is very rich, although is not very quantified, as the civil society representative was saying here, because we don't see the numbers. But at the end of the day, we see the quality, and then we see the results and the impact that they do have in development. But I think that so we need a more discussion on the principles themselves. We have 4 principles so far. That also it's also in the self-assessment framework. But I think that we need to have other kind of indicators so we can see the real impact of South cooperation in development. Thank you.
Ahora, señor Álvaro Ponce de
Mr. Álvaro Ponce de León, could you give us one other good practice? We have heard many good practices from you, but perhaps you could mention a practice that uses the efficiency of South-South cooperation. Yes, in fact, Anita, the discussion has been quite interesting, particularly when we have heard about monetizing South-South cooperation. But what I would like to say is the following. In the context of trying to improve South-South cooperation, I would like to give you an example of what has happened in Colombia, looking at the institutional point of view. So we see that Colombia is quite participative in South-South cooperation because we look at a territorial aspect. This is something that we have emphasized because we need to ensure that we are appropriating projects. Now, the problem that we have is that we do not have the linkages that we need. So we do not have a national law that allows us to create a national system for cooperation. If we had that, then we would be able to move from the local, the territorial, to the national sphere. And I would also like to say, in terms of accountability and transparency, what we should learn is how to improve governance using databases, because that is the way that we could measure regularly cooperation. And looking at all the alliances and ensuring transparency, we need to include other mechanisms for participation, as well as including follow-up mechanisms, whether these are technical follow-up mechanisms or payment for results. These other mechanisms also need to be taken into consideration so that we can measure South-South cooperation. Thank you very much. Thank you. And now, once again, I will give you the floor, Mr. Morales. Perhaps you could give us one more good practice for South-South cooperation that uses the effectiveness principles. Yes, I think that I mentioned something before, but what I would say is that one of the practices that could help us improve is ensuring that there is permanent multi-stakeholder dialogue, as we are having here. I think we need to be able to sit down together, have discussions, put forward our proposals and ideas, and this will allow us to be more effective, because it isn't the same to simply expect governments to take sole responsibility. There are other stakeholders that can contribute to a national or regional agenda. And I do think this is something that we really still need to work a lot on. I think this is the kind of space that can allow this dialogue. In Latin America and the Caribbean, we need to sit down, we need to speak about this, and then we need to put actions into practice. Another issue which could be seen as a challenge is that each country has to understand that it has its own capital, its own ability to create South-South cooperation, but each country has to do it themselves. And there has to be some way of promoting South-South cooperation. Reciprocity, it shouldn't just be us holding out our hands to receive something. We also need to extend our hands out to be offering something. So we in Colombia have many things that we could offer to other countries. And each country has to understand that they have assets and they need to capitalize them. But we need to ensure that all of these practices are institutionalized. Otherwise, we are simply sticking to wishful thinking. We don't need any more diagnoses. We have already done enough work there. We know what the situation is, and now we need to put things into practice. And then we need to use the mechanisms to really put things into practice.
So important to have these multi-stakeholder partnership alliances. It's part of also the BAPA plus 40, but also what you're saying about having specific budget assigned to South-South and Triangular Cooperation in the countries is very important. And that can be done through the strengthening of agencies, right, of development cooperation in the Global South. So I think there is also important role of GPI that can support that strengthening process. Maybe André de Mello, you are a scene setter, but you would also like to mention a good practice on applying the efficiency principles?
Yes, thank you for giving me the floor, Anita. Is this working? I assume it is. Okay. No, I would just like to say the following. It is very hard to contest the Busan principles as they were put in an abstract and generic form, right? Which stakeholder is going to be against more transparency, more accountability, more focus on results, more local ownership, and the like. But the problem comes when you try to implement that, and when you have to fill in the detail. As the saying goes, the devil lies in the detail. And then you start to have different responses to the implementation of these principles, and you also start to have political disputes regarding this implementation. And just to give perhaps an example, when we talk about efficiency or effectiveness, we do so in an abstract, generic way, and that seems fine. But it is important to ask efficiency or effectiveness for whom? Because there's always necessarily a standpoint involved. So to give you an example, for instance, when we talk about applying focus on results in several issue areas such as education, what we see oftentimes is that the vertical accountability, or accountability to the taxpayers of the funders of the so-called donor countries, works a lot better than downward accountability, and accountability to the local constituencies that are supposedly the beneficiaries of interventions in these issue areas. And so this is just to say what is very efficient for one stakeholder might not be as efficient to another. Effectiveness always has a political side to it as well, and I think we have to keep that in mind. And that would be my recommendation. And I'm not speaking here on behalf of any particular country or looking at any particular experience, so I'll give a more broad view. Thanks, Anita.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Andrea de Mello. And I think it's really important, this adaptability, because you can't just replicate something that happened in one country. Like what happens in Brazil might not be really replicable to Honduras. It's
Absolutely.
more like adaptability, right? So the South-South and Triangular has to bring this element of adaptability. So I didn't forget about you, Amer Bukvic. I know you are patiently waiting for your turn online, but we are really also very interested in hearing your view on particular good practice on South-South Triangular Cooperation and how these effectiveness principles can highlight them. Over.
Thank you very much. I'm patiently waiting to join you in person, actually. But let me come back to the question. Well, as we are aware, as it has been mentioned a number of times, South-South and Triangular Cooperation aimed at giving Southern countries an alternate channel of development and exposing them to knowledge and expertise that could be more relevant to their context. Now at the bank, we believe that the Global South, as I mentioned in my first intervention, has a wealth of knowledge, know-how, and expertise that can be shared within the South and with the North for tackling development challenges. And these challenges, as we are all aware, are very huge with all the effects now with the COVID and the climate effects and the inflation effects and the crisis in Eastern Europe. The challenges are enormous. So to adequately tap into the wealth of knowledge that we have in the South, we need to have both in place the local ownership as well as national development plans supportive of the South-South and triangular cooperation. However, as we are aware, there are challenges related to both aspects. From our long-standing experience in the Bank of South-South and Triangular Cooperation, the challenges are first the lack of national strategies for South-South and Triangular Cooperation. Availability of such strategy would help the Global South to identify their priority areas as well as potential gaps or developmental needs that could be addressed by South and Triangular Cooperation, both as providers and as recipients. Second, the absence of focal point or national agency for South-South and Triangular Cooperation. The existence of a coordinator at the national, local levels is of a huge importance to orchestrate all activities related to South-South and Triangular Cooperation. This body can also facilitate collaboration with other countries from provider as well as recipient perspective. I believe that as development partners involved in South-South and Triangular Cooperation and with the support of the countries from the Global South, we can actually tackle these challenges and more to than them to enhance the effectiveness of South-South and Triangular Cooperation. Strategic partnerships with all stakeholders concerned and cross-fertilization are of huge importance in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Such very important points for reflection. And now we are very inspired by all these comments and inputs, and we have also the time for questions and answers. Apparently we do not have any from the remote, but we have a lot of praise on your call to action. So according to colleagues Luis, Roa and Rafael, there's lots of enthusiastic praise on this call for action. Let's not just talk about South-South, let's do it. So I think that's great, Henry, that you have stimulated all of us on this. So as there's no questions from the chat, there could be from the floor, please. And if possible, identify yourself before you ask your question.
Yes, hello, I'm Gerardo Bracho from Amexid in Mexico. And I arrived a bit late, so I didn't hear all of you. But I heard Henry Morales' intervention. I thought it was very interesting. And I wanted just to comment on this issue that was also mentioned by our Colombian friend, which is that of monetization. I want to recall that for example, in Latin America, we were not very happy with this idea for many years, because the idea was that if you monetized your technical cooperation, which is mostly what we did in Latin America, then it would turn out to be very low. Why? Because the wages in Latin America are very low, the inputs of our technical cooperation was very low, so we had this idea that if you monetize your technical cooperation, it would turn out to be very low in relation to the northern technical cooperation. So there was always a political, well, not only political, I mean, there were good reasons for us not to monetize. In the case of Mexico, at some point, there was a law. We had a law on cooperation, in general cooperation, and the law told us that we had to monetize to be accountable to our own taxpayers. So we did that, but I mean, in general terms, we used more, let's say, for monetizing Mexican cooperation, we used political power purchase that gives you a better idea of what are really the costs. But then, I mean, thinking of how we can monetize in other, I mean, in other type of exercises that are going on, for example, the TOSD in OECD. It's more than an OECD adventure, but I mean, those who know what the TOSD is a new kind of measurement that is being thought by OECD and other stakeholders. That's not ODA, but it's broader than ODA, and that wants to bring not only North-South, but South-South cooperation. But anyhow, the thing is that we are thinking that the way that we should monetize technical cooperation is using general wages. I don't know if you did that, Henry Morales, using, let's say, UN wages, or using wages of a typical northern country as a parameter. So when you are thinking about the Cuban technical cooperation, you don't use Cuban wages. I mean, the wages in Cuba, because of course they are very low and you cannot compare them with the North, but you would use, I don't know, UN wages or American wages, and then the technical cooperation of countries like Cuba or Mexico would appear much, let's say, much higher, but also better related to what's going on in the North. So my question is, how did you monetize, how did you consider the wages in the case of Cuba? And in general, I think that if we are going to monetize technical cooperation, we should use general wages, or we should use other parameters to quantify inputs, not just the local ones. Thank you. But I'm interested in how you did it in Cuba, because if you used Cuban wages, I would be very surprised that you had a very high level of.
I believe there's also Anna from OECD that wants to OECD. Yes, we were together in Lisbon a couple of weeks ago. Good to see you again.
Buenos días, bom dia.
Good morning.
Anna Fernandes from the OECD, also from the team that is working on triangle cooperation, bringing evidence, but trying also to go on action, and that's a little bit related with what I wanted to say. So very interesting points from all of you, but my question is more related about how can we link the different processes? Because we had BAPA 40+, which was very good in Argentina, with very interesting, messages coming from there about the need to go for action, but also the need to be better in working together and scaling up innovation that is coming from all the parts of the world. And that's why also South-South and Triangle is so interesting, is to bring that innovation that is popping up everywhere and scaling it up. And then we also have these processes in Lisbon. And I remember in BAPA we were discussing the voluntary guidelines of the GPDC. And then we have Lisbon, which, by the way, it's very much aligned with what you said. We need more data. We need finance, global finance. And we got the UN South-South office announcing that they might have a facility on triangle cooperation, financial facility. But we also need to get these processes together somehow, because then we need to move to action. And we try to organize these marketplaces where people can, talk to each other in terms of concrete projects and programs, but that's a very minor scale. So my question to you, coming from a body that is producing part of the evidence, where we can see that triangle is moving to all the parts of the world, and that South-South is also a fundamental piece of this global architecture, how can we put all this together? The different events, the different guidelines, the different settings where we are discussing this to really move it to the ground, to the country level, where we need to start being much more focused and collaborating more. And, you are the countries and you are the institutions. So how can we bring civil society, private sector, foundations, academia, with governments, but at the country level, which is one of the fundamentals of effectiveness. So very curious to hear from you, and very nice also to see all of you, and let's keep championing these ideas that are helping us to reform this multilateral architecture and move it forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Maybe a last question over there.
Gracias.
Thank you, Jordana Munoz from the CPTI from Nicaragua. South-South cooperation is very clear to see. We see that there is an exchange of knowledge. There is also an exchange of lessons learned. And I think this is something that we could capitalize on. What other types of South-South cooperation could we look at? We have added value in this kind of cooperation. It is added value for the populations that benefit from them. And that is why I think we need to make more efforts to ensure that there is effective development cooperation through triangular cooperation. And we do need to find new mechanisms so that we can look at the different types of development cooperation. We believe that there are spaces that are now closing. There are less types of cooperation mechanisms. And so this type of event really is vital for us to take into consideration the different types of cooperation that do exist in the world. Thank you.
My suggestion would be that we stop now with the questions because it's already 9:26 and we have a little round, let's say 1 minute each again. Maybe we can start from the remote so that Amer Vukvic doesn't have to wait too long. So Amer, for you to answer these 3 questions maybe. I think you are muted or there's been a sound problem.
Sorry.
Ah, yes.
Yeah. What I understand is because some of the questions were in, I didn't understand the language, but what I understand from the 2 questions was that generally how to scale up. I will talk on this for shortly. Well, to scale up, we have to start from the national level. And our countries in the global south are already doing a lot in actually intensifying their cooperation. Of course, as it was mentioned by one of the colleagues, we are not on the same level. We have different experience in different countries. So what we did at IDB, we tried to bring all the agencies that are working on South-South cooperation. We did this in 2016 in Indonesia. We brought all the agencies together, and some of them in our member countries have very positive experiences, like we have with Morocco, with Tunisia, with Palestine, and Indonesia is also doing a lot in developing it now. So we, for the further improvement, we need really to have a right institutional arrangement to be put in place. And we, as IDB, we have identified a set of institutional arrangements. And these arrangements were collectively presented through the National Ecosystem for South-South and Triangular Cooperation, which have several pillars. First is the political will of the country to be engaged in South-South and Triangular Cooperation. Second, the Development Cooperation Agency or body that acts as a national focal point for South-South and Triangular Cooperation. And thirdly, the information basis that enables countries to map their national capabilities and development solutions that could be shared with each other. So this framework is one of our own contribution to the outcome document of the second high-level United Nations Conference of South-South Cooperation, BAPA plus 40, which was held in Argentina in 2019, that highlighted the need to strengthen the national institutional arrangements in the countries of the global south in order to develop their capacities to engage in South-South cooperation. Now, in the operationalization of our framework, we do through the capacity development program for enhancing national ecosystems in member countries, which we also approved a few years back in 2019. Under this program, we are first assessing the capacity gaps of national ecosystems for South-South and triangular cooperation, identifying weaknesses, as well as priority areas of intervention, and doing an action plan through the participatory approach with all the national stakeholders. And second, we're designing a comprehensive capacity development solution that would enhance the national ecosystems of South-South. This program is fully aligned with the effectiveness principles in all our interventions, from country ownership to result-driven interventions, as well as partnerships and transparency and accountability. We are currently working with many of our member countries, of our 57 member countries, at the moment with Cameroon, Guinea, Palestine, Tunisia, enhancing their institutional arrangements. And we are ready to work with all the development partners and the members of Global South to further enhance the effectiveness of South-South cooperation and to scale up the cooperation between developing countries and beyond in this decade of action. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the floor to be the first one to talk this time. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. And I think we have a minute each maximum for just the last thought, because we will have to apparently vacate the room, I'm told by my colleagues. So maybe starting with you, Andy.
Just very quickly, I would say that in response to the comments on South-South cooperation and how to move to action and scale up. From Canada's perspective, we see triangular cooperation as a key mechanism in facilitating South-South cooperation. So to that extent, the GPI for trilateral cooperation is we think, an essential convening forum. And we'd encourage anyone who is interested in engaging through the GPI to do so. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Vieira.
I'll be very quick because I have another presentation to make. But just to respond quickly to what the lady from OECD was requesting about the synergy between different processes, I think that what we need to build is the harmonization of approaches. And then I have to tell that when we had BAPA for the first time, and then now, 4 years after, so many things changed. That's because in somehow we were able as well to create this synergy, and then also to boost a little bit about harmonization on the approaches. It's not an easy task because, you know, the international community have different initiatives and approach. International institutions as well, they have different approach. But I think that we, when we talk about South-South cooperation, we'll be able also to harmonize some approaches. For instance, the journey that we made from Paris to Busan, so we have been improving the approaches, the principles that now we are applying them to South-South cooperation. So from Monterrey to Addis Ababa, it was also a journey. But I think that all the governments and then other stakeholders, they have been working together in order to put forward those principles. And then at country level, from the experience of Cape Verde, I have to tell you that within the partnerships committee that we have with the donors from the South and partners from donors from the North and partners from the South, we do have dialogue commissions where also civil society, private sector, academia, they do take place in order to see how to improve our deliverables. Thank you.
Thank you. Alvaro?
Two comments I'd like to make very briefly about triangular cooperation. Without a doubt, it's more in the potential of triangular cooperation, especially right now because of the situation we're experiencing at the global level. It is critical to pool these efforts. This is what's going to make it possible for us to have a greater impact. And there are, of course, the limitations that we're hearing about. And Colombia has focused very much, that is a fact, on strengthening triangular cooperation. Recently, there was a program with a couple of countries to define triangular cooperation. We believe very much in it. Now, as to the last comment that was made about monetizing cooperation, well, there was a debate, but not much of a consensus as a result. There isn't one single methodology to monetize cooperation. It's not only through salaries, but also the valuation of what the cooperation means in terms of the quantification of the transfer of knowledge. There are factors there such as the mechanisms of the impact. In the case of Colombia, we're fully open to maintaining a dialogue. We're not closed in that area, but we do acknowledge that there's no consensus about this measuring and evaluation. Thank you very much. Yes, I think that these are somewhat controversial subjects, but they're interesting as well, of course, how to measure results and how the contributions in kind, the importance of these. So a couple of minutes left. Henry, well, just to say that well, from the point of view of the Mexican peasants, yes, we're in line with that, but I'd like to say a little bit more about our experience. But when this study was run, the point was to carry out an exercise involving a cooperation between the North-South cooperation measuring systems with the activities, comparing it with the activities that we do in the Global South. So in order to be able to carry out this type of comparison, one has to use the parameters that are used in North-South. And we carried out a very complete list of all of the procedures and all of the parameters that were used, and to define technical cooperation from one person for example, who's an expert in something. On that basis, a calculation was made, not so much in national salaries, because each country has its own reality, its own system of dealing with this kind of thing. We did not use that parameter, in other words. It was more a question of market conditions for comparison that we used to carry out this monetization.
Último minuto de André.
Thank you, Chair. I'd also like to jump into the issue of monetization. I'd like to recall, sure, we need measurement. There's no question about it. This has been said by several of the panelists here. But measurement does not imply necessary quantitative measurement. There are also qualitative ways of measuring things, including flows and projects and results. And it doesn't imply monetization either. My own country, Brazil, has also been very critical of initiatives to monetize development cooperation. And I'd like to second what the Colombian representative said here. It's not just about salaries. This is one of the key issues. But there's also deeper issues about how do you measure, how do you monetize knowledge? If South-South cooperation is mostly or primarily about the transfer of skills, about technical cooperation, about the transfer of knowledge, how do you measure that? It's not just the time and the salary of experts that are being sent overseas. but it's rather years of research and R&D in public institutions in our own countries that are being involved. And again, that's very difficult to monetize and to know the exact value in monetary terms. And I'll stop here. Many thanks.
No, thank you very much, and thanks for the patience of the organizers, because we ate up 9 minutes, but that also shows that we've been very proactive in the discussion, and you have provoked a very big debate. I was supposed to have a little closing statement, but in view of the time, what we will do is continue the discussion on South-South cooperation in the panel 8, I think at 11, so I'm sure that we're all going to be very bringing these questions on board. And for me, what I bring back home, which is not too far, by the way, is the question of solidarity, mutual accountability, and also thinking about how to measure results in such a way that it's at the same time, you know, capturing all the contributions in kind and other forms of contributions, which are also, so let's say the monetization thing we can park for the time being, but definitely will bring the results-based efficiency of South-South cooperation back home with the solidarity spirit. So thank you very much. Gracias. A round of applause.